Got it.
She's gonna give an introduction.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
We're ready.
It's not going to be a fancy introduction.
Oh, well, hold it
It's
down.
just a microphone part. Hi, I'm Sharon, and so I'm one of the members of the Faith and Mission meeting that put on the Summer Sundays this morning. So this morning we have Shirley and Steve and Tom, and in their Shalom class they studied this book that they're going to share with us. And so I will pass it along to them and let them share with us what they studied.
Thank you. Today we are talking about Christendom, the Triumph of a Religion, AD 300 to 1300. Yes, 1,000 years of history, and we're going to do this in about 1 minute for every 20 years. The author, Peter Heather, is a professor of medieval history at King's College London, and he is the author of 12 books, co-author of another, and editor of yet another. Many of his books are about the Roman Empire, and he's a very respected scholar on that subject. Christendom includes a bibliography of 50 pages and 2,000 book-length sources. So he's very familiar with this literature. The book traces the history of the Roman Catholic Church, which was the dominant force in Christianity during this time period. The author is British, and he is a member of the was a member of the Church of England, so he was not Catholic. Steve will begin the book and talk about the developments beginning the 4th and 5th centuries. Tom will talk about 5th and 6th centuries. Steve will then go back to 7th and 8th, and I will discuss events and major players in the 9th through the 14th centuries. If you have questions as we proceed, please feel free to speak up.
Well, I want you guys to know that this is a 700-page book, and I memorized every word of it. There's only one problem: I forgot to remember what I memorized. So, I get to start at 300 of the Christian era, which is kind of late, isn't it? I mean, 250 years after Paul wrote his letters. That's a long time. But we're going to skip over that for now. We're going to start around 300. You should know, as Julie said, that this guy is a historian, not a theologian. So he comes at it from a slightly different angle than most of us are used to. But I will say this: he acknowledges some of the core tenets that we all agree on, that Christianity is based in love of our neighbors, love of God, and that salvation is available to anyone who believes. He acknowledges these core tenets. But then he goes right into the political and economic forces that were at work in creating Christianity as we know it. Since there's a lot of information here, you'll have to forgive me if I miss a date or a name occasionally. If any of you know the date or name, just correct me right away.
Yeah, we'll keep you straight.
Yeah. Now, since some of you do know most of the story, all of you know some of the story, I'm going to highlight the angles that he takes that bring out some of the things we don't normally think about in the story of Christianity and the growth of Christianity. For example, well, his first few chapters are entitled "The Romanization of Christianity." So he's going to bring out the ways the Roman Empire influenced Christianity, things like church hierarchy kind of modeled on the administrative model of Roman society, things like that. Here's a fact. As a friend of mine would say, here's a fun fact. But here's a fact. It's actually not a fact. It's his interpretation now that I think of it. But we tend to think that Christianity caught on like wildfire and just spread immediately through the centuries and just grew exponentially. Unfortunately, that's not quite accurate. he says that historians have come to a kind of a consensus now that rather than Christianity being roughly 10% of the Roman Empire in the year 300, it was more like 2%. Now, that may strike you as odd, but this is what historians think nowadays. Now, in the cities, obviously, it was higher. Maybe 10% in the city, maybe 15% in the cities. But most people lived out in the countryside, right? So they hadn't heard the good news yet, and they hadn't heard it, it's been a long time, and they hadn't heard it yet. The point that he makes then is that Christianity grew more slowly than most of us have been taught. Now, to be fair, he says that by 550 Christian era, over half of the people in the Roman Empire were getting baptized. Now, whether that made them full believing Christians or not is kind of uncertain, because apparently a lot of people just kind of went along to get along. You know, they wanted to be, they wanted to advance their careers, and once the empire turned Christian, they could safely do that. They wanted the favor of the people above them, so they would join up in Christianity so that they could advance their careers. One of the places that Heather starts is with one of the large persecutions of Christians. This is the great persecution of Diocletian in 306 to 303 to 306. Now, it's true that a lot of Christians were persecuted, but historians now think it was probably fewer than we imagine. Now, we tend to think like, you know, concentration camps is what we tend to think, or, you know, mass killings. It wasn't quite like that. He argues that it was more like a group of 40 here, a group of 40 there in that city, maybe 100 over here, total around 1,000 maybe in this persecution period. What it amounts to is that the 40 killed over here sent a clear signal to everyone around them that this is bad, you know, and that Christianity should not be supported. The Emperor Constantine, most of you have heard of him. He's the one behind the Council of Nicaea. He came to the throne in 306. And by the way, just one last point about the persecution of Diocletian. Not everybody went along with it in his administration. Some of them stopped persecuting after just 1 year. They started saying, wait a minute, these people aren't that different than us. I know this guy. I know this Christian over here. I'm not going to turn him in. I'm not going to burn him at the stake. So it wasn't as widespread as we tend to think either. Constantine, of course, is a turning point, one of the major turning points in Christianity. He had a conversion experience, kind of like St. Paul. He was going into a battle, and he saw a cross in the sky. At least this is the story we're told. So he realized that if God was on his side, he was going to win the battle, which he did.
What year was that? When was that? Roughly.
312, the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312. By 324, he had dedicated his empire to Christianity. But he did not persecute other faiths or other belief systems. He became Christian, but he tolerated other religious groups. Now, once your emperor has turned Christian, and you want to advance your career, you know, well, I think I'll become a Christian too, and then I might be able to move up in the ranks. Now, let me say that obviously there are other perspectives about this, but Heather is writing as a political historian. He's writing the history of the politics and the economics of Christianity. So that's not the same as a theologian would write. Now, what set the Council of Nicaea in motion is what's called the Arian controversy. Some of you may be familiar with that, but apparently there were a large group of Christians who believed that Jesus was not equal to God, but subordinate to God. And this, we don't know, may have been a quarter to a third of all Christians. Now, When I say all Christians, that's a bad term, isn't it? That's not true. What it is the intellectuals on both sides, the small group of theologians and thinkers who were representative of their regions, who were disagreeing about this. The vast majority of people didn't know anything about it, and they didn't care about it. You know, they were busy loving their neighbor or tilling their field. You know, they were doing the normal things that regular people do. They weren't literate, for example, by and large, so they couldn't read any of these documents. The Council of Nicaea was called in 325 to settle the question once and for all. The question is between God and Jesus as being equal, that's homoousios.
That's right.
And homoiousios. Homoiousios has an I in the middle. That's the only difference. And the I is called, I'm sure, the iota. The iota. So it makes not one iota of difference. To some people, right? I'm sure you've used that too, right? To some people, it makes not one iota of difference. For example, the Council of Sirmium in 356, they said that these issues are far beyond human comprehension. Why are you down there in the weeds nitpicking the slight differences between words? And it's far above human understanding. But they got overruled.
Hey, St. Nicholas thought it was so important, he punched someone over it. and got
Really?
arrested. So Santa Claus got arrested over the issue. It's gotta be a big deal.
Yeah.
And what year was that?
325.
325, okay, wow.
He was at the council, traditionally.
I'm going probably over my time. I'll just say a few more things. One of the things that Heather brings up, is that for a lot of the early Christians, they had a rather confused sense of their self-identity because the doctrine hadn't been settled yet. And a lot of them maybe only had access to one gospel and one letter of Paul, right? A lot of the churches treasured their little readings, but a lot of them didn't have like the whole corpus of New Testament like we have. And some of them didn't have the Old Testament. And some of them really didn't like the Old Testament, a lot of them. They said, that's not our God, that's not the God of Jesus. And they wanted to get rid of the Old Testament. Those are the Marcionites. They were a pretty big segment of early Christians.
Well, that's true today, too. There's a lot that just don't pay any attention to the Old Testament.
I think that's true. I think that's true. Michael Catlett used to say that was his dad. I forget that.
I said they were called heretics, but they came in the back door of the church.
There you go, yeah.
Stayed for a while.
Yeah, they're still around, yeah.
Steve, where, is it Marianites?
Marcy.
Marcionites. Where, were they in one particular region or were they spread across
They were
the
spread
entire-
around, but they were outside of Rome.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly.
So you mentioned Marcion was about 150, so we give a time perspective well before Nicaea. And Marcion is also well known for beginning the canon of a Bible before. So this is before the conflicts of this very critical time, 150 of Marcion.
Well, and one of the conflicts of self-identity is the Jewish Christians. You know, well, wait a minute, am I more Jewish than Christian, or am I more Christian than Jewish, or can I keep on doing the Jewish things? Can I keep on sacrificing in the temple? Obviously, a lot of early Christians did. They kept on going to the temple. Jesus went into the temple. Now, he didn't argue against the temple. In fact, he was all for the temple. All he got rid of was the money changers, right? Now, he didn't speak out specifically about animal sacrifice, which many Greek philosophers were talking about all through that period. They were saying animal sacrifice is an abomination. With Nicaea, what was local variations, local syncretisms, that's melding of groups or beliefs, became heresy. And this process lasted a long time, over 50 years. In fact, right in the middle of this process, you have an emperor, Julian, who comes in and says, I want to bring back all the pagan rites. He was a Christian, he was taught to be a Christian, but he disagreed with all the arguments that were going on between the Arians and the non-Arians. He said, that's not Christianity, I'm going back to the old ways. So this issue of whether God and Jesus were equal or Jesus was subordinate to God was put on the back burner. It was finally solved around, what, 380, 370, somewhere in there.
I mean, ostensibly solved, but then the church decided to fight over the nature of Mary. Was Mary the mother of God, or was Mary the mother of man?
Right.
Which was really a fight about Jesus at the
Right.
end of the day. So it was solved, but
Right.
the first 700 years of the church, it was a question. It still existed.
Well, and this issue of self-identity, how you think of yourself, was pervasive. It was an issue. As I said, are you more Jewish than Christian or not? Can you be a Platonist and read the writings of Plato and still be a Christian? Obviously, a lot of people did. A lot of intellectuals did. They thought, yeah, I can read Greek philosophy and still be a Christian. I can borrow from it. That way I can allegorize the scriptures to mean what I want them to mean. You can allegorize the Old Testament. I gotta speed up, I think, a little bit here.
But if I may, just what's interesting is how, we all say people don't change, because you can be a scientist and be a Christian. Like, people think that science and religion or Christianity, whichever you want to pick, like, they can't coexist, and it's not true.
Yeah.
It's completely not true.
Yeah.
There's somebody who's both.
Yeah, well,
So-
one thing I come across I'm in a contemplative group, and people say, well, you can't be a contemplative and use your reason. You can't use human reason. If you do, you're not a contemplative. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. I mean, to most of us, we would say, give me a break. Maybe when you're in contemplation, you feel like, oh, you're one with God. But when you're not in contemplation, you're in the world, and you're going to use your reason every day. You're going to be reasoning about all sorts of things. As an aside, the Greek philosophers said that kind of reasoning in the world, they called it logos. And they said that that's divine also. That reasoning in the world is also divine. It's the eminence of God, as opposed to the transcendence of God. Well, I think I've covered a lot of these early chapters. I think you've got the point now that the Council of Nicaea made a big difference, because before the Council of Nicaea, a lot of Christians would still attend the pagan festivals. They enjoyed a good party. It's like Halloween, right? My sister used to refuse to let her kids go to Halloween. She said it's pagan. It's a pagan rite.
Steve?
Yeah.
So when you talk about the Council of Nicaea, is the bottom line is characterized by the Nicene Creed, or is it broader than that?
No, well, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of changes that came about due to the Nicene Creed. The primary one, though, is, I think the ultimate primary one is that Christianity divided into the us and the them, where Christians could think that other Christians are heretics and need to be suppressed. That was kind of one of the major, in my opinion, that would be one of the major dividing lines of Nicaea. And that is one of the great turning points in the history of Christianity.
Well, the irony of that too, Steve, is, 325, we have the Arians classified as heretics, and yet Constantine decides not to get baptized until right before his death.
Right.
And he's baptized by an Arian priest who was considered a heretic by his own council, 50 years or 30 years before. So, yeah, how rigidly these things were observed, it's hard to know looking back in history.
But remember, it was a vote.
That's right.
And they could have changed their vote
Right.
coming along and joining the side of the majority,
Yeah.
It was a
So
vote.
there were lots of ironies and
You know.
ambiguities, and one of the ambiguities, is that when do you get baptized? Well, Catholics, of course, thought infant baptism, and that became the dominant form of baptism. But as Rob said, with other more intellectual people and higher up people, like Constantine, they didn't want to, there was an issue about if you get baptized so young, what about when you sin after that? Are you still going to go to heaven? What if you do some really bad sins after you've been baptized? Can you still go to heaven? So a number of people put off getting baptized till they were on their deathbed, like, with Constantine. That way you got all your bases covered. The persecution of Christians, how am I doing? Okay, I am over there, I know I am. Just a couple more points. Persecution of Christians was considered a form of martyrdom. You're dying for your faith and for Jesus Christ. You're dying for your faith. Once Christianity got in power, when the majority of the empire started adhering to Christian standards and rules, etc., then you can't be a martyr anymore, right? You can't. So what do? You go into the desert and become a monk, and then you transfer that martyrdom to being a monk. You're going to martyr yourself to God by living an ascetical lifestyle in the desert. It was a big transition, but an important one, as we will see in coming chapters. Once the Christians solidified their power, of course, they became pretty, what's the word for it? They weren't nice to the non-Christians. Starting about 380, from 380 to 430 or whatever, in Alexandria in particular, they went on a rampage and tore down every pagan shrine, temple, synagogue that they could get a hold of. Now, to be fair, some of the synagogues and shrines were turned into Christian churches. But one of the most, historians will never forgive the Christians for tearing down the Serapeum in Alexandria, which was the great center of learning. It was like a university complex. It had a pagan temple in the middle, but it also had a huge library, a hospital, a teaching hospital. It had astronomers, geometry, it was like a big university. And they tore it down to the last stone, supposedly. Now, to me, it's unclear whether they really tore the whole thing down or just the actual temple to Serapis that was in the middle of the complex. But then, not only that, Christians started really seriously persecuting other Christians. Heresy became the mark of, and not only that, they would tear down the other Christians' churches. If you were a heretical Christian, you could get your church torn down as well.
So those became the new martyrs.
It's kind of a circle, isn't it, John? I'll stop there. Okay. Who's next?
Can I sit? Is that
Sure.
okay? First, I'm honored to be here. I don't know how Shirley has this limitless.
Pass him the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he's got it, I'm sorry. Please
Is it
continue.
on or not on?
Yes,
or-
You're good.
Okay. I'm glad to be here. It's an honor. I've been part of Shalom in this study for 30 years. I blame my mother-in-law for recruiting me, Martha Poling, if you may remember. She got me in here, and I've still been here. And Shirley's limitless energy in our group to bringing us on this book. This book was picked by, I believe, Bill Conway, right? And we read books, we read the Bible, and we argue, and we differ, but I just wanted to thank everyone for that. And I was gonna just mention a couple of points about the author. So I'm going back to the introduction. Because in Shalom, when we differ, someone will say, well, cite your reference, what page are you reading? And sometimes we're on different pages, But the author, in a couple of his words that were key to me in the introduction, is his writing. He says, all told, the capacity of medieval Christianity to generate a unity in religious culture amongst the vast majority of Europe's population is an extraordinary historical phenomenon. Is the point? And in the introduction, he cites 2 points, because remember, he's not only non-theological, but he's actually an ex-Anglican. He's writing as a secular historian. And he'll even say that in the chapter. It could be his bias, or he could be offering a different point of view, and you all decide. He says contingency. It didn't have to happen the way it happened. Multiple things happened to allow Christianity, and one was Constantine, that Steve mentioned. Well, we're going to talk about other things. The second is his beautiful words is in the introduction. It just got me, and that's why I finished reading the book. This book aims to give full weight to contingency, to Christianity's almost limitless capacity for self-reinvention. It had to adapt and evolve, in my language, scientific language, or progress, sorry. It had to self-invent itself to convert people, his words, of this extraordinary capacity. So Steve talked about it in Constantine. I'm going, just when things are going along great here, we got Constantine, we got the Nicaea in 325. What happens in about 410? Oops. He says history doesn't look at it just as a single date of the fall of Rome, but a series of migrations of tens of thousands of people. Tens of thousands of people across the Roman Empire in the 400s. And if anyone wants to know, I don't know, he even calls them Franks, Vandals, Alans, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths. They came with their kings, and their kings converted to Christianity. And the top-down approach, he says, then the kings would bring their people along to convert to Christianity. And in 480, so for example, Nicaea 325, Rome is sacked 410, 480, comes somebody called Little Wolf of the Apostle of the Goths. Who was that, Bob?
I don't know that one.
Oh, I'm honored. I didn't do that. Was the first translation of the Bible into Gothic. This was a huge thing for the pagan religions, that there was a scripture, that there was study, there was a book. 480 translated into Gothic. Okay, now, I didn't want to spend a big time, but he is big on this continued conflict of the Arians. He calls it the Nicaeans versus the Homoians. And he said that goes on for 250 years. This conflict where the tribes would pick one side over the other, still over the divinity of Christ. We're trying to explain both humanness and divine. But he says it wasn't settled and defeated until 589 in the Third Council of Toledo, where the final extinction of the Homoian challenge to Nicene orthodoxy converted all the Visigoths to the Nicene faith. So there were differences and conflicts, and then consolidation. Just when things are going along well, guess what happens in the 600s? Here comes Muhammad. So first we have the Western Roman Empire falling, but we still had Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire. And he says what happened is there was a big fighting for decades between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persians, and they bankrupted each other. and the Persians took over Jerusalem in 600. And that area was very weak, and the Arab tribes were able to unite with Muhammad, but even beforehand, against Roman occupation, Eastern Roman occupation, and it spread. The Jerusalem fell to Islam in 638. But one of his points in correcting history is that it took centuries for majorities of countries to turn to Islam, by majority. Egypt, Syria, wasn't to 800 or 900. Took time for those countries to convert. And one of the main reasons in converting was Arabic replaced Greek as the business, cultural language of the time. And many families changed names and converted. Some may have been persecuted, pressured. Others, and there's a term for this, there was a Christian minority in the Islamic world, but there's a specific, I can't even pronounce it, they were still viewed as second-class citizens. Okay, so then we have, moving on to 600, trying to understand how Christianity moves to Britain and Ireland. And here comes St. Patrick's and the monks. Big movement of overtaking the pagan Anglo-Saxon religions of the time by setting monasteries up, by, he says they were able to they were able to criticize the pagan religions. They were to offer them, let's see, what's he say, superior religion, because they appealed to a message of escape from violence, Christianity, to die in honor in battle for the afterlife, and spreading justice. Imagine that. They admired the Old Testament for spreading justice. Okay.
Can I share one of my very favorite stories
Oh,
about
sure.
when they first got into this area? And they're as they go into the Persian or the pagan areas, these first Christian missionaries are trying to talk about Christianity. We're talking about the adaptability of Christianity, and they do the whole thing: justice, the spiel, the die in honor, and all this. And there's a story told. The farmers, these townsfolk would go, well, this pagan religion keeps us from having elves in our field. Does Christianity keep the elves out of the field? Do you have a prayer to keep the elves away? And the missionaries go, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And they wrote a liturgy that you could pray to keep the elves out of your farmland. But there was a wonderful story of this fight that happened between these two towns, because the towns discovered they were each sending the elves into each other's farmland as they went through. But it's just another example of them coming in and just adapting themselves to the needs of elves are a real problem, and we got to keep the elves out of our farmland.
It was, oh, I'm sorry, yes, please.
Tell me again, the time frame you're talking about, just right.
600.
600. I couldn't remember what you
Okay,
said.
roughly 600 is that time period. The first 597 was when Bishop Gregory sent some monks to England, and then went to Ireland. 600. But it's, we did a whole chapter. He talks about the importance of the development of the monasteries. Fascinating. Tax benefit. Tax benefit. There was a tax benefit to give to the monasteries. But also, what I didn't know, you could donate part of your money to the monasteries and get out of your land estate with your children. There was a way, it was a little harder to break up your estate, but if you gave some of it to a monastery. And the monasteries served as study, visiting priests. It would hold some of their children who needed housing. Big important function in the development of a monastery and spreading Christianity. My last chapter is then he swings back to Central Europe after Rome fell, and basically he says there was a major problem. Distance. The population was rural. How were they going to get the word to the peasants? He used this as a specific example. I think it's harder to have to drive to the Baptist church on Sunday. They had to walk 6 miles to get to a church for a service, and 6 miles back. They didn't have a lot of services back then, but they found a way through adapting and understanding some of the holidays, the agricultural thing of the times, Christian magic was inferred, to reach out. He calls it a two-way street, where Christianity informed the peasants and the local population informed Christianity in a two-way street. And it grew. Last point is, okay, let's see if the minister knows this one. What year, let's take a guess, did bishops allow priests to preach with sermons? Isn't that a good question? He cites this as a fact. Come on, guesses.
Nope.
Century, how about a century?
Ninth century,
Okay,
the 800s.
all right. Any other guesses? No, okay. So remember, my time is 5-600, so this is 529. Remember, they had to get the priests out there to the poor people they could see once in a while. So they started developing they finally gave, because the bishops are in charge, remember, not the popes yet, bishops were local. There was local autonomy, local authority in the churches, the bishops. And they gave priests the ability, and they apparently had some pre-made sermons and dedicated sermons that were simple and upbeat to meet the needs of the
What year was
people.
that?
So, that's the end of my piece.
So at this point, there's still, from a Christianity perspective, it is Roman Catholicism.
Sure.
There's
yeah.
really nothing else.
Little c, right?
Yeah.
Catholic means universal, so the
Yeah.
church is,
Okay,
it's the Catholic Church, right?
okay.
And,
I just
and,
wanted-
and we look at,
To the
looking
Reformation.
at that it became more and more centralized as time went on, with the different Christian groups being labeled heretics or extinguished, or, but at one point he does say during this time, the popes were very weak still in 500-600. I know Shirley will talk when they start getting power. But they were only consultants. They were only asked if they had an opinion. They had no authority. Often they would write something in groups, but the idea of a pope in 529 is very different than I think in your time.
Well, and
Very
the
weak.
Eastern patriarchs are also trying to assert their authority
Their
at the
authority.
same time. And Pope Gregory, in your time period, really combated that and really became the servant of the servants of the Lord. He was a very humble pope that really showed kind of what was possible. So it wasn't about top down, it was about being minister. And it really sort of, I think, started that trajectory of beginning that authority of Roman influence in the church because of his humility, frankly, what he did.
So you see this creative tension between diversity and hetero, whatever the right word is, Steve, hetero, versus a move towards orthodoxy, or stop. Thank you.
Instead of you.
Heterodoxy and orthodoxy.
All right, move, right, heterodoxy, whatever.
Okay, I just got a couple more chapters, so I won't be as long this time. And I'm gonna overlap with some of the things that Tom said.
Steve,
It's not
excuse
my
me.
fault, it's because,
Can you swap microphones with Tom? We're picking up his much better than yours.
okay.
It is not a preference by the Lord. It could be read it to the shows it, no, come on, we have fun in our class, you know, we poke at each other.
Well, but anyway, it's not my fault that there's overlap, because the author, he goes back, you know, you can't stop authors from doing that. If they want to go back in time, you have to let them do that. So one of the other turning points in early Christianity is what's sometimes called the fall of Rome. And that's a problem for a number of reasons, but Rome fell over a series of decades, as Tom said. 410 was the first incursion of Goths, Visigoths, and Vandals. By the way, that's where we get the word vandalize, to vandalize something, from the Vandals. And then they kept coming back for more. They were basically looting the place. Some of them were actually already Christians too. Some did convert to Christianity, but some of them were already Christians, and they were looting the other Christians. This went on. 455 was the last major ransacking of Rome. One of the things that is significant to our study, and I'm skipping over a lot of stuff because it's not that relevant, is that these looters ignored the monasteries because the monasteries didn't have any money. Right? So they let them alone. There's a bunch of them out there in the deserts in Egypt, in Palestine, in Syria. And they just said, forget about them. They ain't got any gold, so we're not going to bother them. And then eventually the monasteries became one of the bulwarks of Christian teachings, Christian education, Christian culture, because they were left alone. When Islam came through in around 600, I think it was, Tom, I don't remember what you said, but around 600, somewhere in there, they went to the Serapeum too, and any books that were left, they burned them. Because, you know, the Christians didn't get, we're going to finish off the rest of them. So it was dire times for some Christians and non-Christians at that time. Now the monasteries, because of these pressures from these tribes and these other groups, they moved west and north. As Tom said, they went all the way up into England and Ireland. That France was a big center. Spain was for a while until the Islamists came up and took over Spain as well. But the monasteries spread all over, and they became centers of learning, culture. They kept a lot of the books. In fact, they kept a lot of the Greek books. They kept a lot of Plato and Aristotle and other Greek writers as well. Then Peter Heather does another backwards turn. He goes farther. He goes to the origins of monasticism. I promise I'll go fast here. But the origins of monasticism really go back to the beginning. There were some Christians in the early days who would go to the outskirts of town in little groups of women maybe, and they were going to be chaste, chastity. They would live on the outskirts of town. There were other groups of Christians who wanted to pray in the desert, and they would go a little farther out and do like Jesus did, pray all night in the wilderness. There are others who pooled their resources and lived in common, like in Acts, you know, some of the Christians did that. The earliest monks we have record of, though, who moved to the desert are in 324 of the Christian era. A lot of these other people were they weren't organized at all. But the first monks were hermits. They were eremitics. They were hermits, and they lived alone. And they would get in a little cave out in the desert in Egypt. In fact, they would dig down in the ground to where it's cooler there, right? So they would dig down there, or find a little cave where it was cooler, and they would call it their cell. This is their cell. And this is where we get the word cellar, of course, cellar. It's partly underground, but it's cooler there, so they would survive the heat. There was a huge Christian monastery in Egypt called the Cells, Kelia. It was the Cells. Hundreds and hundreds of Christian monks lived there. The first guy to establish a community was Pachomius, and he was probably inspired by Pythagorean communities and Manichaean communities, but we don't know for sure. He definitely refused the Christian advances. They wanted to make him a bishop, and he said, not me. I don't like this hierarchical structure. I'm a Christian, we're all equal here. You know, he was a Christian, again, this issue of syncretism, right? You could be a Christian Pythagorist or a Jewish Pythagorist. We know there were groups like that. You could be a mixture of things. Then we get Anthony the Great. Anthony the Great, who was the first monk to be celebrated all over the place. His biography by Athanasius was spread all over the place. And he lived as a hermit for 20 years, by himself for 20 years, just praying, doing ascetic practices, not eating, basically, not sleeping. That's what ascetics did back then. And he eventually came out of his cell and was persuaded to establish a community like Pachomius had done. So then there were a lot of Christian monastic communities that were set up in Egypt after St. Anthony. I don't think there's a lot more to tell about that. This is my piece for that section. I will add one thing, maybe Rob knows about this, but one of the impetuses, is that a word? One of the things that propelled people into the monastic life was a tract called On the Contemplative Life by Philo of Alexandria. He was a Jewish philosopher he was Jewish, a Platonist, and a Pythagorean all at the same time. Wore those labels proudly, was well liked and well acknowledged in all three of those fields. He wrote a tract called On the Contemplative Life, which he describes everything that we think of as a monastery. And so the Christians latched onto that from 300 on. They said, this must have been a group of early Christians, first generation Christians. It must have been. They were wrong. But the word had spread, and for several hundred years, all the way through Pseudo-Dionysius 525 of the Christian era, he wrote, they were called the Therapeutai, and they were actually Pythagorean Jews with a touch of Hermetic philosophy, perhaps. And everybody thought they were Christians for hundreds of years. So that's one of the main reasons why people went out to become monks. Isn't that strange?
Yes.
One other reason that the monasteries were very popular, particularly through the medieval era, was in a society where primogeniture rules, when the oldest son gets everything and the rest of you don't get much, it provided an opportunity for advancement for the younger born children in the family as well.
Yeah, that's right, there was something for them to do.
There was something for them.
Yes, because the elder son would be getting all of the property.
Right.
So what are you going to do with all your other children?
Right.
So send them to the monastery or the abbey or wherever, and then it turned out to be an income generating enterprise. So they weren't left destitute. They actually had a pretty good future there. So this period of time, the 9th through the 14th century, is an epic saga of emperors, popes, crusaders, taxes, and some questionable hiring practices by the church. So the expansion of the Christian empire began in 750, the Western expansion. The Christian emperors were on a mission to build God's kingdom on earth. And the standout among them was Charlemagne. He was a devout Christian, and he had been brought up by Christian parents. He wore many crowns. He succeeded his father, Pepin the Short, as the king of the Franks, and then invaded Italy and crowned himself king of the Lombards. And then he set out to evangelize on his way to Rome. So by evangelize, what we mean is we tell people about the story of Jesus and his saving grace. And if they decide that they would prefer the pagan approach, then he had his army behind him. And they would come in and just take over and got a lot of loot. They stole, they killed people, and they took that back. A lot of it went back to the church in Rome. So Charlemagne was a very big supporter of the church. And Pope Leo III rewarded him very handsomely by making him the emperor of the Roman Empire in 800. And also, Charlemagne had helped him use his forces to put down a rebellion among some of the nobles in Italy at the time. So Charlemagne expanded his realm throughout most of Europe. So now it was a Christian continent, basically. The Christian institutions flourished under Charlemagne, thanks in part to all this loot he had acquired from all of his military campaigns, but also he instituted this mandatory ecclesiastical tax. In other words, a tithe that was mandatory. That provided the church a steady stream of income. However, not all the money reached the altar. The nobility were the ones who built the churches, and they had a hand in what happened to the money that came in. And so they took a part of that, well, probably a generous part of that, and their portion of the tithe was then included in their descendants' inheritance. So it continued for generations. Christianity continued to expand. However, not everyone agreed on who got to steer the church bus. Rome claimed primacy. So supposedly because the church was founded by Peter and Paul. Well, the Bishop of Rome provided the best argument for supremacy, because all these bishops they had throughout the Christian empire all were saying, no, we should be the primary bishop, But fortunately, there was a set of letters and decrees from St. Clement of the 1st century, and these papal letters were released by Isidore Mercator in the 9th century. And these documents supported Rome's claim to being the primary bishop and therefore should be pope. Well, it was later determined these were completely forged documents. They became known as the false decretals. But even after everybody knew that, the Pope still remained the supreme authority in Rome, even though he was there on false documents. So Pope Leo IX in 1059 claimed, and this was another big deal, that the Pope was to be solely elected by the cardinals. Now, who elected the Pope before? Well, it was the nobles. It was the kings and the nobles decided who was going to be Pope. Well, Pope Leo the Ninth said, nope, we are going to decide. So if anybody saw the movie Conclave,
Yeah.
so one of the lines in there was, this process of selecting the Pope has been in place for 1,000 years. Well, it was Pope Leo IX that established that process.
What year was that, Shirley?
1059.
1059.
Yes. So for 1,000 years, the nobles and the kings had made the decisions on who was going to rule the church, because it was a secular enterprise. But this did not stop the kings around the empire from hanging on to their local church networks. After all, who wants to give up a profitable institution with divine authority? In 1059, a plea came for help from Byzantine Emperor Alexis I. So he said, send knights, we're being overrun by the Muslims. Well, Pope Urban II said, this is a really good idea. I can send people there. This is going to unite all the nobles in the kingdom, all in the empire. The kings and the nobles had been fighting each other over land and various things. And so he got them to unite against a common enemy, the Muslims. Well, they didn't go straight to Alexis to help him. They instead planned to go to Jerusalem. So Pope Urban II went out on a really massive campaign preaching the benefit of going on a crusade to free Jerusalem from the Muslims. And he even offered salvation and the remission of sins for all who died in the service of Christ in the quest to free Jerusalem from the Muslims. Well, okay, so now it's the Pope who's offering salvation. That's a change. The Pope was now granting salvation for military service. However, some of the nobles were really not that motivated for religious reasons, but they did see a chance to expand their holdings. They could get some new lands, maybe some wealth, and some power. So approximately 60,000 to 100,000 answered the call of Pope Urban II. And they decided to head east to go free Jerusalem. Well, these were not all knights. Some of them were poor peasants, and they were not trained. And as you can imagine, they took a lot of losses on the way. But they did fight their way to Jerusalem and took the city in 1099 and declared victory. It was messy and brutal, but for the church, it was proof that God was with them in this campaign. This was God's work they were doing. But these campaigns continued for 200 years, and it was the church's preferred outreach strategy. From the Muslims in Spain to the pagans in the Baltics. By the 13th century, Latin Christendom stretched from Iceland to the Balkans, and Catholic Christianity became the religion of Europe's elite. And where the elite went, the peasants soon followed. In 1215, Pope Innocent III hosted the Fourth Lateran Council. It was the largest church council ever assembled. The goal? Clean up the clergy, define the doctrine, and reinforce the church's authority. They banned child appointments to clerical positions. They outlawed the sale of offices. So bishop positions were for sale. They outlawed it. And they emphasized clerical celibacy. Penance became central. Penance was closely tied to repentance earlier, but in the Middle Ages, it evolved into a legal matter, and sin became breaking the law, and penance was the spiritual fine, and the church courts handled it all. Of course, laws must be enforced, and that's where things took a darker turn. In 1208, Pope Innocent III called a crusade, this time not against Muslims and Jews, but against fellow Christians in southern France, and they held heretical beliefs according to the Pope. Thousands were slaughtered in the name of doctrinal purity. The crusades against the Christian heretics, however, didn't go quite as planned. And so, the next step, the Inquisitions. That started around 1231, and that was another attempt to root out heresy. The church launched formal investigations, authorized torture, eliminated appeals. Confessions were coerced, punishments were brutal, and enforcement often targeted the poor. The Spanish Inquisition in 1478 focused on converted Jews and Muslims suspected of backsliding into the faith that they had abandoned. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, sought to suppress Protestants. Death sentences, forced confessions, and even exhumed corpses, which were taken up and then burned again because they had been heretics in their lifetimes. Yes.
The Protestants themselves began in 1530, or when was?
No, it was before that. Remember the
Martin Luther before.
Martin Luther was when?
1517.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yes,
Sorry.
so they had had a chance to spread.
But by the way, one of those exhumed corpses, John Wycliffe, the first man to translate the Bible into English from Latin, the Synod of Orange declared him a heretic and that he needed to be condemned. Fortunately for him, he'd been dead for 20 years. And they dug up his corpse to burn his corpse to teach him a lesson about translating. Let me tell
Yes,
you.
because they didn't want anyone to read the Bible for themselves
Correct.
and do their own incorrect translation of what they were reading. Notably, when the inquisitors in France started charging local nobles with heresy instead of poor folks, things changed. The nobles appealed to Rome, and the inquisitors that had targeted them were quickly removed, and soon afterward, they were inexplicably murdered. Yeah, inexplicably murdered, yes. The nobles got to them. Yes. In conclusion, the story of the Christian faith in Europe was a mixture of personal faith, personal experience, personal expediency, and political convenience. Sometimes people were converted with sincerity, but often others were baptized at sword point. Conversions of the nobility and the landowners often trickled down. But once the institutional church built its empire with bishops, taxes, canon law, and the Inquisitions, it had unprecedented tools to enforce belief. Christendom wasn't just about faith, it was about power. But despite the coercion and the corruption, something enduring took root. A shared Christian identity stretched across Europe. Cathedrals rose, monasteries thrived, and millions came to believe, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And today, there are 2.3 to 2.6 billion Christians globally, the Catholic Church being the single largest Christian denomination with 1.3 billion members. Thank you.
So, I guess everyone else probably knows this. So, Protestantism began before Martin Luther?
No,
Well, Martin Luther was after the date you indicated, right? You said 14?
1517.
Huh?
1517.
Oh, 1517, okay, good, we're good. All right,
but there
I thought
were
you
some
said-
precursors to that.
No, I thought you said
There
14,
were
I'm sorry.
a number of
There
precursors.
were, what really made Protestantism be able to endure was the printing press.
Yeah.
That many attempts
Right.
before
Yeah.
to reform had happened, but
Yes.
you kill the messenger and they're gone. Suddenly the printing press comes and the message spreads and you can't control it anymore. And to see, you were talking about power, to see Innocent II, who's about 100 years after Urban II, who was probably the most powerful pope ever, who was dictating to kings what they should do and what they, who they should be. Within 150, 200 years, the Crusades, mismanagement, everything else, the papal position itself had lost tremendous amounts of authority, and regional kings were suddenly going, maybe we don't have to do what the bishop says. And that's really also what laid the groundwork for like German clergy going, if we're not sending our money to Rome, we could keep it. Maybe Martin Luther's got a point. And so it began, its loss of power through the Crusades and other things really did sort of shape and create the opportunities for reform.
And so, in the Crusades that went to France
Right.
to kill the heretics
Right.
there, those heretics were asking for some of the same things.
Right.
We want this, we would like to be able to read the scriptures. So, yes, it's been messy. It's not been a clean process, the evolution of Christianity,
Yes.
but it survived and thrived.
But you
And,
look at this and you realize people have always been people, right? I mean, the issue of money and power.
Yes.
I mean, it's
Yes.
not, there's nothing new under the sun in
Yeah.
this, it really isn't.
so the book we're reading now is Christianity, Ancient Christianities through 500. And we hope to read the book that comes after this one in 2035, I believe is when it's supposed to be published.
Is it by the same gentleman? That's what I
Yes,
was gonna
yes,
ask.
yes.
So he's doing 1400s through today?
No, yes, he is going to, yeah, that's what he says. It's in
Give it
his,
10 more years? Come on, buddy.
yeah.
Shake a leg.
But, it takes a long
How many
time to read
references? There are 50
2,000 references,
pages of
books.
references,
Yes.
God.
And that's really outside his field of expertise, really, because this is his area of expertise. So,
Good job.
thank you very much.
If anybody has not seen it, I highly recommend the series Wolf Hall.
Spell it.
You can get it on PBS and stream it. There's 2 sessions of them. There's one that came out about 8 years ago. And it's about Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII and all the wives and all of that. But the second series is like 8 episodes. It's just outstanding acting. It's a wonderful production. But it focuses on the split of the Church of England, becoming, for Henry VIII's ulterior motives and all that. But it's really quite educational and, written by a historian that was then put to, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's highly recommended.
What was the name again?
Wolf Hall. Wolf Hall. Wolf Hall is the name of a place in the state where the royalty lived part of the time. Okay. And Thomas Cromwell was this come-from-nothing blacksmith's son who somehow rose to become the legal aid to, I'm losing a blank, whoever whoever the bishop was for Henry VIII. And then became Henry VIII's. So he was his man of favor until Henry VIII and his whims decided to cut his head off too. Yeah.
Yep, off with his head. Yeah, it's a book. It was based on.
Yeah, it is, right.
I started reading it.
Yeah.